whereas the Germans were playing at it as if it was a game. Dense nets of rigid rules were built into forced institutional schooling 100 years ago in preparation for the advent of a big industrial economy and a big government to match. That's exactly why schools function as they do, in order to construct a predictable proletariat who serve faithfully because they don't know what else to do. Trouble is, our big industrial economy in the United States is dying fast, and the big government set up to run interference for it has been spending well over $500 billion a year, more than it earns. So the familiar bells and loudspeaker schools built around low-grade intellectual training, built around the strict rationing of skills, and an absolute minimum of practical applications, and a maximum of drills in passivity and obedience. Those tools once served the factory economy well, are now unable to help us produce the much different kind of citizens needed for the dangerous future ahead. Rule-driven schooling gave the countries which practiced it the most docile, predictable, and manageable populations on earth, a joy for the leaders of business and government. The schooled can always be counted on to do as they're told. But in the globalized 21st century, the dogged persistence of lockstep pedagogy is economically worrisome. Too many zombies are making us uncompetitive because our competing nations have lots more zombies than we have. The answer from policy circles about this problem that's emerging has been we must have even more of the same. More hours, more days, more homework, more tests, more college, a more coercive transfer of officially approved curriculum designed to make the classrooms teacher-proof. In this recommendation, critical thinking and artistic expression and actual applications of learning have been pronounced irrelevant, a waste of time. But what if, just what if, regimented schooling is the disease making us sick and not its cure? My inspiration for 30 years of classroom teaching was the rite of passage of Australian Aborigines, in which a young fella grows up on a long and solitary walk full of marvels and dangers. He comes to know himself on this walk. And that's why I call this talk Walkabout, and I call it Walkabout London because a walking adventure at age 4 changed the life of Sir Richard Branson, as he tells it in his autobiography, Losing My Virginity, which I found on an airplane seat and read on the way to somewhere, Budapest or somewhere. Branson was 4 years old, out on a ride with Mother, miles from home in London, when Mrs. Branson stopped the car and asked 4-year-old Richard whether he thought he could find his way back from where they were. Just take a second and put yourself in 4-year-old Richard's place and then in Mrs. Branson's. Yes, he said, whereupon Mother told him, well, get out and do so then, and she drove off. My mother was determined to make us independent, Branson remembered to a magazine reporter 52 years after the event. That was in last month's New Yorker magazine in the States. Once he got home, he could never submit easily to institutionalization again. Eventually, he dropped out of high school, skipped college entirely, and had his first important business at age 19, while his friends were still college undergraduates. Branson considers that walk to be the most important lesson of his life. Just try to store that in your mind to reflect on. But we all know dropouts are dead ducks, right? There might be one exception here and one there. They're dead ducks, right? You hear that daily in the States. Branson's walkabout and the dirt farmer savvy of Shen Wen Rong, who had no schooling at all, are things more easily achieved, obviously, outside school than in. That's the common historical experience of mankind. It helps to explain why it took almost all of recorded history before factory schooling came about. There's not a single syllable about school in the American Bill of Rights. Forced schooling wasn't considered a right worth having, although guns were. I couldn't agree more. I hear all the time these days, I'm president of a gun club, I hear all the time these days the people who don't graduate high school are ruined. Those without college are doomed to be flunkies lifelong. Yet something puzzles me. America's two best presidents, by everybody's standard, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, had almost no school at all, and neither had any college. And America's two most potent industrial titans, John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, were from the same unschooled tree. Thomas Edison, who gave us the electric light, dropped out of elementary school. The head of the Human Genome Project right now, which has to be far and away the most prestigious scientific job on earth, didn't see the inside of a classroom until high school. He followed a perfect open source learning method with his homeschooling mother and his homeschooling brothers. I hope someone bothered to tell you that. But Francis Collins, who has a book out now, Francis Collins, learned self-mastery and intellectual power and flexibility in a homeschooling situation with his four brothers. They followed no pattern at all, except if they were going to change a subject, all four brothers of four different ages had to agree, and then they were off to the races. No attempt to have a balanced diet, no concentration on science or anything else. They followed their hearts. This is the number one scientist in the world, regardless of what some academic from a university may tell you. Every corporation on earth is lined up to get something from the Human Genome Project. By the way, for what it's worth, he's a born-again Christian, even though he was raised as an atheist. When he was in college, he said the decision became intellectually inescapable. It's just fascinating. He makes the other scientists very nervous. So, now we're going to get to that lady who was a legend in the MIT admissions office. On April of this year, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal both carried front-page stories about the firing of MIT's legendary admissions director, Marilee Jones, who had held the top spot at MIT for 10 years and was there for 28 years For the first 18, she was a specialist sent to raise the number of women going to this big-time technical college. She caught my own daughter. It bankrupted us. Anyway, she tripled the number of women at MIT, and then they gave her the top job, and for 10 years, as the papers say, she was a legend all over the country as a leader in the college admissions field. And MIT gave her the highest honor they had for a school administrator, their Excellence Award for Leading Change. So why was this superstar fired? Well, on her original job application 28 years ago, she claimed 3 college degrees. But what she was actually doing, instead of going to college, she was a torch singer. Think of that for a moment. I hope that expression translates to Australian. Okay. A torch singer is somebody who, while you're having your 5th drink, tries to make you burst into tears, singing about unhappy love affairs and broken hearts. And some of them are really good. I guess Mary Lee was really good because she invented 3 college degrees, MIT, bought it hook, line, and sinker, and she revolutionized the admissions process there and all over the United States with no prior training, no academic record. Now, according to the New York Times, these are quotes, she was beloved, almost revered, and the Wall Street Journal said she was considered irreplaceable. Even the man who fired her acknowledged that she was superb. That was MIT Chancellor Philip Clay, who told the press the door was now closed to another Miss Jones. In the future, we will take a big lesson from this experience, he said. A big lesson. You'll forgive me for being rude, but the president of MIT is clearly too stupid to see the real lesson in the Jones affair. The degrees are paper with no power whatsoever to signal merit. Whoever they get to replace this woman will certainly be inferior to the woman they fired. That's the lesson I get from Mr. Clay. Quality resides in your ability to add value to your community. And on that score, torch singer Jones gets A+, and bureaucrat Clay gets an F. Judging people on merit, not titles, would seem to be the most efficient attitude as well as the most honorable, but the cancerous growth of test-driven schooling since the end of World War II is a return to the medieval outlook of scholasticism. That's 600, 700, 800 years ago, whereby the godly are deduced through faith-based syllogisms like honors degrees. Unfortunately for degree holders, real merit still demands visible works, not abstract paper promissory notes. In the modern through-the-looking-glass universe, Miss Jones lacked enough paper credentials to justify her high position, but through the fog of credential sickness, I hope you can see that Jones proves that a dropout is a dead duck only if he or she believes the propaganda. You may be interested to know when school certificates and college degrees were first connected to work. It came about in a German military state called Prussia in the year 1763, when the head of the political state, King Frederick, decided he wanted to create a new job category called school teacher and school administrator, and he wanted to multiply by a factor of 10 or 20 the people who had work in colleges, and the public didn't bite, so he invented the jobs, but nobody bought the service. So he changed the rules. He said you can't have a job without one of these diplomas or certificates. So dropping out of school does not mean dropping out of education. We're talking here about 1.25 million people a year in the United States who drop out, and perhaps 10 times that number who would like to drop out if reasonable alternatives were offered. The reason this isn't possible is ugly. Schooling itself is the biggest employer in the civilized world when all associated forms of support labor are factored in. It's the major contract giver. When attendance dips, jobs are dumped, and contracts are lapsed. No wiener roast without the wieners. The minute you take your blinders off and see schooling as a jobs project, you will know why dropouts are despised. And there's another reason just as strong. Dropouts represent an unpredictable X factor, a potential fifth column to management because they have been insufficiently conditioned to accept standardization. The prejudice is understandable in a short-sighted way, but over the long haul, an economy so dysfunctional, it compels its citizens to accept services neither wanted nor needed is a bed of Procrustes which spells trouble for the nation. Every school day in America, 7,000 students walk away and they don't look back in spite of all the propaganda. Several million more fake illness every day. Should all of these people be dragged back screaming and jammed into classroom cells with others who, in theory at least, want to be there? If that had been done to Abraham Lincoln, who didn't go to school at all, would his spirit have survived to become Abraham Lincoln? He was our Civil War president who freed the slaves. Some say it's only fair to force attendance because kids don't realize that without certificates, you can't find opportunity. But where that is true, it's only true because law and prejudice make it so. Think of Mary Lee Jones at MIT, with 3 degrees have made her a better admissions counselor. How is that possible? Better that you send all the admissions counselors into nightclubs to be torch singers for a few years. Now think of the filthy slum urchin, Lula da Silva, grown to the presidency of Brazil without a certificate. Brazil, the nation which next year will be the first nation on earth to be energy independent of that stuff coming out of the ground. Think of Lula when they tell you you have to have school certificates. Think of Hitler, a penniless gutter snipe from Linz, Austria, who could not make the cut at art school, so for want of anything better to do, rose like a meteor to dominate Germany, the most formally educated nation on earth. Does this not reveal something vital about PhDs and specialists and the obedient in general? How did these folks figure things out? without a teacher to tell them what to do. Think of John D. Rockefeller, who floated the future on a sea of oil, or the Wright brothers, who taught us to fly. What effect should these facts and thousands more just like them have on our unexamined assumptions about seat time in classrooms or about college degrees? If you can get a dropout to talk to you, you'll be told that school is a liar's world, that it has nothing real to teach, and whatever can be memorized inside can be memorized outside. Are they wrong to say this? Coke Stevenson, who many believe to be the best governor in 20th century Texas history, grew up in the no-man's land of South Texas before World War I. It's a place very like Australia's outback. Coke had a one-man overland freight business taking cattle and goods to and from a railhead 90 miles away, fording 3 rivers through Bandito country. If you need models to understand open source, Governor Coke Stevenson's a good one. He taught himself so much through self-reliance in the Badlands that one day he decided to become a lawyer, but he didn't go to law school. Instead, he lay on his belly on a grassy hill near the state capitol in Austin, reading cases on his own, and when he felt ready, he took the bar exam, passed it, and argued himself in history. There's still a couple of American states, California is one of them, where you can do that. It used to be, of course, that everybody did, or everybody who wanted to did it that way. Abraham Lincoln became a lawyer that way. Thomas Edison, the holder of 1,003 patents, was a 12-year-old train boy on a long-distance train running the length of Michigan far from his home by using all his wits and his small earnings to best advantage. He owned 2 small businesses by the time he was 13, a grocery store and a newsstand. That made 3 streams of revenue in his pockets if you consider his salary as a train boy. At 16, he was publishing a newspaper, carrying up-to-the-minute news of Civil War battles using the train company's telegraph. The London Times called it the first journal ever printed on a train in motion. He eventually became patron saint of the electric light, electric power, and music on demand, the phonograph. As for a college degree, Edison pronounced it, I quote, a meaningless credential. With the coming of the internet, a growing number of intelligent young men and women find school a dead letter. By contrast with school, the net offers uncontrolled access to uncontrolled information. Let me give you just one example of that. There's a wonderful new book out in the States called The Cigarette Century. I mean, it's as thick as a telephone directory, and it's the inside scoop on the tobacco industry. But in the beginning of the book, the author says that he had given up trying to get any inside information because the tobacco industry wouldn't cooperate, and he was going to cut and paste from newspaper articles. Then someone told him, I clear my throat, that on the internet there were 40 million pages of private tobacco company documents that had been forced to light in the discovery process in court trials. And he went there, it would have taken him 40 lifetimes. That's probably why the book's so thick. In such a climate as now exists, privileged information melts like ice in the sun. Education thrives, but formulaic schooling is a dead man walking. The reason we force school is wrapped up in invisible assumptions that important people hold about ordinary people. It would take a long, long speech to tease out all the strands, but the main themes are easy enough to see, and they're very, very important for you to know. In every age, the powerful are convinced that ordinary people, particularly their children, are dangerous and have to be controlled. I'm going to give you a few examples of this, but I guarantee you, if you had 6 hours, I could give you example after example. In 1535, John Calvin wrote that the great mass of people were damned before birth by God, and nothing could redeem them. Forget sin and redemption. That was the Roman Catholic idea. Now there was only sin, no redemption. And Calvin was a lawyer, so in this enormous book, the last edition published in 1535, which I'll bet would be in a library in Brisbane, he nails it down just exactly what the damned are capable of, and they overwhelm the saved, and no amount of good deeds can convert you from one to the other. No amount of prayer, nothing can change your destiny if you're damned. What then to do with these sinners who greatly outnumbered the saved? The answer was to teach them to police themselves through intricate nets of rules and regulations, rewards and punishments, habits and attitude training. In this fashion, the damned can be alienated from themselves and from their natural allies. Calvin had, of course, invented familiar institutional schooling. In 1670, this will be even more hair-raising. Benedict Spinoza, who's carried in most libraries as Baruch Spinoza, but he never signed his name Baruch Spinoza. He signed it Benedict Spinoza. He was a secular Dutchman, hit on the same pessimistic outlook as Calvin. Their differences are only cosmetic. For secular Spinoza, the damned were just a silly superstition. But the dangerously irrational, capital I, were everywhere, and just exactly like the damned, there was no way to cure their irrationality. Spinoza, I'm going to give you the title of the book, and if you ever take a deep breath and get the book, really, even if you're bald, the hair will stand up on your head. The book's called Tractatus Theologico Politicus, but he's quite a clear writer. It was read in the British colonies of North America by leaders. It was read in leadership circles for centuries to come. I'm going to come back to Spinoza in a minute, because when you hear exactly what he designed schooling to do, you will recognize your familiar schools. 150 years later, in northern Germany, Johann Fichte, a philosopher, picked up Spinoza's warning, and he resonated it through Prussian schooling. The Prussian schooling is the world's first successful institutional schooling. There any other that you stumble upon in a book of school history, they're all fakes. They were laws passed. Nobody had the bad sense to follow those laws. But Prussia used bayonets to march people into the cells. So it worked in Prussia, and from all over the world, as far away as Japan, people came to study how Prussia did it and why they did it. And the founder of United States Schooling, Horace Mann, begged the school committee back home to bring Prussian schooling to the United States. Anyway, so Fichte